First of all, Ted, is there any scope for a technological or legal middle ground?
Well, I think that Congress should consider the alternatives. Our elected representatives are put in that position in order to do that, to think about solutions to these difficult problems. And that's what this debate was all about. The government does not have the authority to require Apple to redesign its iPhone to disable the characteristics that it put into the system, which is what its customers wanted. There's no legal authority for that now, and one judge has already held that. So there has to be some discussion about how to solve this problem, if there is. But you cannot conscript a private company such as Apple to do something to change its products. We have civil rights that prevent that sort of thing.
I spoke with Attorney General Loretta Lynch yesterday, who said the middle ground is the courts. Let this be decided on a case-by-case basis, as it already is in the judicial system. Under any circumstance, would that satisfy Apple?
I'm amazed that she would say that. It wouldn't solve anybody's problem. You might have one court going one way and another court going another way. FBI Director Comey himself yesterday said this is a problem. He said it's one of the most difficult problems, or the most difficult, I've ever faced as FBI Director. And before that, he was Deputy Attorney General. This is something that Congress needs to debate one way or the other. If you do on a case-by-case basis, you're going to have different outcomes in different cases in different parts of the country. Director Comey says they've got 12 or 13 other cases in which they're trying to do this in federal courts. The Manhattan District Attorney said he had 205 iPhones he wanted into. You can imagine, multiply that by every jurisdiction in the country. A case-by-case solution is no way to go about this at all, and I'm amazed that the Attorney General would say that.
Now, Ted, I've spoken to security experts who say that they believe there are technical alternatives here that don't involve building a master key to all of our iPhones. In fact, former head of the National Security Agency, General Keith Alexander, told me he doesn't buy Apple's argument that this is the only technical way. Are there technical alternatives?
Well, there might be technical alternatives. In fact, Director Comey yesterday, when asked about whether he had consulted with other branches of government to try to solve this problem so that the government wouldn't be forcing Apple to redesign its product, and he said, we've talked to everybody who will talk to us. Well, what does that mean? Has he consulted with the NSA? Is the NSA, the National Security Agency, able to help but not willing to help? I don't know the answer to that question. The experts at Apple, which designed this iPhone, say there is not another way to do this except to give the government what it wants, except to redesign the system to break down its security system, which is what tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people have relied on when they bought the product to begin with. They're depending upon the security that Apple built into the iPhone, and the government wants to destroy that. If the government has figured out a way to get around that problem itself without causing Apple to redesign the iPhone, well, then they should do something like that, and the government officials involved in this should be asked that question directly.
So, Ted, back to my question, is there a middle ground? Because it sounds like Apple's saying there isn't.
Well, there isn't a middle ground that I know of that requires Apple to go to work for the government. We have a Constitution. The Constitution does not allow the government to conscript private citizens to invent products or to change the products that they have invented in order for the government to look into the product or to cause the product to do what it wants. That's a very, very significant thing. There may be ways. Now, the government has considered issues like this in a statute called the Community Assistance to Law Enforcement Act, CALEA, and it specifically exempted companies like Apple from having to do this sort of thing. Congress might consider some of these things, but if you're asking Bloomberg or Fox or the Wall Street Journal or Apple to redesign their programs to supply assistance to law enforcement, a manufacturer of a car, or anyone like that, then the government doesn't have the power to do this except in the most exigent circumstances, and the government hasn't demonstrated that those circumstances exist. And when we talk about this now, we're talking about a system that would break down the phone, not just in this case. The government said it's about one phone, and now Director Comey admits that it's not about one phone. It's a precedent that they would use in other cases. So this is a very, very important point. Once you cross over that line, there's really no limiting principle that the government has articulated.
Ted, one of your arguments is that it would cost Apple 10 engineers 4 weeks to do this. Apple is the most valuable company in the world. It has thousands of engineers. If any company has the resources to do this, isn't it Apple?
Oh, Apple could do it. It could devote a segment of its engineering program and other technicians to do something like this. What's the limit? How many people? What companies? The same thing that is being asked of Apple could be asked of a smaller company. It's the principle that the government doesn't have the right, and there's no legal authority that gives it that right to require a company such as Apple to redesign its program. It's not just redesigning the program. It's not just putting engineers to work to create a product that the government wants that Apple didn't design and specifically avoided designing. It is asking Apple to create something that it doesn't have to do, to create a new product. And all those Apple iPhones that are out there with tens of millions of people, the programs that they bought it for, the security, so that they could keep their most intimate private information, including things like the location of their children or where their children go to school, that's kept private now. The government is asking Apple to undo that. So it's important that Apple would be required to supply engineers and resources to the government's desires, but it's more important that they will have been required to damage a product that millions of people, tens of millions of people rely on.
Ted, Donald Trump is closer than ever to being the Republican nominee. He has called for a boycott of Apple products. If they don't do this, he said he'll force Apple to manufacture in the United States. What do you have to say to Donald Trump?
Well, I'm not going to get in the middle of the presidential campaign. Presidential people running for office, and Donald Trump is no exception, take positions that attract attention to them. The American public and the public all over the world that rely on the finest products ever made to supply them information, to provide their ease in conducting their lives, to provide all sorts of answers to their own problems. They are the ones that will decide that Apple's product is living up to what it's promised to be, and Apple's keeping the trust and resisting intrusions on the trust that it has for the people who have placed that trust in Apple to design a product that they depend upon. That's the important thing.
Now, Ted, at the congressional hearing, lawmakers pressed, what does Apple actually want Congress to do? Somewhat unsuccessfully. What is your legislative strategy? What do you want Congress to do?
What Congress should do its job, which is to consider the various different alternatives, the impact on citizens, balance the concerns of law enforcement, which we respect. Apple's cooperated in every possible way with the government, except for throwing out the design of the iPhone and redesigning it. Congress needs to consider what technological resources exist, what can be done by the government without conscripting private citizens to change the products that they make, and things like that. There should be hearings. There should be expert testimony. They may have started yesterday. There was testimony not just from Director Comey of the FBI, for whom I must say I have the most enormous respect. He's a tremendous public citizen. We're lucky to have him. But to have testimony from him, have testimony from the head of the NSA and other security agencies, testimony from experts that worked in the private sector, and testimony from law enforcement. Let's have this debate. Director Comey has asked for this debate. The CEO of Apple, Tim Cook, has asked for this debate. Let's have that debate. I can't predict where it's going to go, but we should have the discussion, and we'll see where it takes us.
Now, when I spoke to Attorney General Lynch, she shot down the argument that this violates the First and Fifth Amendment, saying, and I quote, "Apple is not a target in this matter. We are not alleging that they have done anything wrong." How do you respond to that?
Well, Apple has First Amendment rights, whether it's being accused of doing something wrong or not. You're absolutely right. Apple has done nothing wrong. And Director Comey said Apple has been very, very helpful in this and every other investigation. They've gone as far as they possibly can. But Apple has a responsibility when it's being asked to communicate with iPhones all over the world that it's created. That's a First Amendment right. So you have a First Amendment right. I'm surprised that the Attorney General that she would suggest that only people that are accused of doing wrongdoing have First Amendment rights. You have a First Amendment right. No one's accusing you of having done anything wrong, and me too. The Apple has First Amendment rights to protect its product, to avoid the government compulsion of what it should have to say to its products in order to change the design of those products. And it has the responsibility to protect the integrity of the right of privacy of all of the people that have all over the world who have depended upon Apple to protect the privacy that they used with respect to these phones. You can imagine what a tyrannical government can do to individual privacy of individuals who are wishing to communicate with one another or their neighbor in private. So we're talking about the rights of Apple to make sure that its iPhone has the integrity that it carefully built into it. So all of those are constitutional rights. Everyone has civil rights in this country, not just people who are accused of crime.
Now, Apple is also arguing that its responsibility to its customers is greater than any responsibility it has to the government. But there's another argument to be made that Apple may not even have an iPhone if it did not benefit from the government's own investments in technology, from everything from GPS to the internet. What if the government made it a condition that to benefit from all of that investment, Apple would have to comply with legitimate law enforcement requests?
Well, I hate to get extreme about this, but it reminds me of the 13th Amendment. The United States government, that made it illegal to have slaves. And that's obviously an overstatement, and I don't mean that literally. But the government cannot conscript private citizens. The government can't say, in order for you to use technological information that might have been produced and put in the public domain by the government, you have to agree to work for the government. That just does not work. I don't know where that could possibly come from. By the way, Apple is a force of great good for this country. Apple has used its creativity, its technological wherewithal, its resources to develop products that have changed our lives, that have made us more free. Where would we be today without inventions like the Apple iPhone and its various iterations, and the iPad and other devices that have created and made us free? And the reason that Apple has done that, the reason that Apple has been so successful at doing that is a constitution that gives incentives to inventors to provide the creativity that exists in Silicon Valley that has made the economic engine of this country so successful. That's free enterprise, but free enterprise depends upon a rule of law and consistency by the government and the various civil rights that are given to all citizens, including companies that are developing products that we all use.
All right. Ted Olson, Apple's head lawyer, Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher. Ted, thank you so much for joining us.